So I'm sure you've heard the story told about Father Sullivan. So Father Sullivan's out visiting one of his parishioners, and he stops at Tommy O'Leary's farm, and he says, "Oh, Tommy," he said, "this is a beautiful farm, and your fields look wonderful, and your crops are great, and you know, God's really been good to you. You know, He's given you a strong back that you can do this, and He's given you this good land and these abundant crops. What do you have to say to God about all that He's done for you?" And Tommy O'Leary said, "Well, I don't know about that, Father, but you should have seen him when he had the farm to himself." Of course, the idea of it is what are we doing with what we've been given? So I contrast that with talking with a parishioner yesterday who has 26 acres of corn right now, and the water's up to the tassels. Bad deal. And so we who live in the Midwest can listen to last week's readings and this week's readings and get a lot for us to think about. So last weekend we heard about dirt. And so the people that I had Mass with last Sunday, I said, "So what kind of dirt are you?" And they thought I was insulting them until we talked about it a little bit. And so we heard last week that there's the rocky soil that didn't have roots. It's really shallow, so things kind of wilted in a hurry. There's other ground which is full of a lot of weeds that tend to choke everything else off, and the harvest dies. And then there's that good, deep soil that we are mostly pretty blessed around here with. Well, last week we started with soil. This week we're talking about the seed. I hope most of you came in admiring the corn in the lobby and the wonderful weeds next to it. You should be able to figure out which was the good seed and which was not. If you don't, talk to Harry Wolfecool after Mass and he'll explain it to you. But we have three parables today that Jesus gives us and helps us to understand how we respond to this. And the first one is a great one. And so the first parable talks about this guy who has this great field. He goes out and sows, and then in the middle of the night the enemy comes and puts weeds in it. And so the slaves say, "Hey, what's going on? I thought you had good seed. Should we go tear it up?" And he says, "No, because we'll lose everything." So don't jump to conclusions, you know. And so you wait, and then later on we'll separate them and things will be okay. And so we look at that and we say, well, how can we apply that to ourselves? Well, 2 weeks ago when we were burying Dad's ashes, after the afternoon was done, we went out to a cousin's farm that we used to go spend time on. And my cousin Tommy took us on a hayride out to a field of the only field of this plant that exists in the United States. He had to sign all kinds of special papers, but it's a special kind of rye. And most of the time rye is pretty tall, but it wasn't very resistant. It can get ergot, and it's a bad deal. So what they've done, this came from Sweden, and they have engineered this so it only gets about this high. You plant it in the fall and not in the spring. And there wasn't a weed in the field. This is an organic farm. Not a weed in the field. I've never seen such a beautiful field in my life. Right at the end of where the rye was planted, the weeds were wild. But that was the most beautiful golden field I've ever seen in my life. And I thought, what about us if we were the kind of field that was planted in such a way that we lived our lives in such a way that it didn't admit any evil, that it didn't admit any weeds? That's why we gather in community. That's why you can't just have one corn stalk by itself, but we gather together so that we can together be stronger and kind of fend off this, what happens when we're sleeping. Because when we're sleeping is when things happen. And I'm not talking about physical sleep here. I'm talking about when we're asleep at the switch. And that's when evil enters our lives. And so you take that with the second parable that we have today about faith the size of a mustard seed. Now, the mustard plants that they were talking about in Jesus' day, if you do some research on them, they got big enough that they were as tall as a man on horseback. And so you had this little teeny seed, which the way mustard seeds are today, and it has this great potential, like these kids, little seeds that have great potential, okay? But a lot of times we don't recognize that. We kind of have this small Iowa humble, well, I'm not as good at this, I don't have enough faith, and I'm not smart enough to do this, and I don't have this, and I don't have that. And all God asks of us is to return to Him what little we have, and great things can happen. But all too often we are making judgments about ourselves and other people. And you know, whether you look at history of the church, you look at the history of our country, you look at things that have happened in your own families, a lot of times it's the little things that have really grown to be great things. And that's all Christ says to us. You only need it, faith the size of a mustard seed. And all too often we kind of back off from things and don't take things on. Well, I'm not good enough, or somebody else is better. God's not going to grade us on the curve. He's going to say, okay, what'd you do with the seeds that I gave you? And then the third one is this only 2 lines about the kingdom of heaven supposed to be like yeast that you mixed into a batch of flour that served as leaven. So what does that have to do with the rest of this? Well, it means that we are supposed to be leaven in the world, and so we should be people that have an effect on the people with whom we live and work. So when you take a look at those 3 parables, they do give us something strong to hold on to. And the first one is this: the guy who sowed good seed in the field. God is always sowing in us. There's not a person here who's alive that God is not sowing something in their hearts. And these 2 beautiful little kids right here, God has already got some stuff sown in their hearts that they don't even know about. Might scare your parents. But for all of us, God is sowing in our hearts right up until the time that they plant us on the last day. So how are we attentive to that, and how are we letting God grow that in our lives, okay? Because God is expecting a great harvest out of us. Now, there are times that we're going to think like the mustard seed, oh my God, I can't do this. And that great second reading that we had today from Romans says, you know, there are times when you can't even pray. Have you ever had a time like that you can't even pray? Raise your hand. The rest of you are lying. Of course we have. And what does Paul say to us? The Spirit prays for us with inexpressible groaning. You're having a bad day, your kids are driving you crazy, your finances are a mess, your in-laws are driving you nuts, and you just go, ugh! God prays for us even when we don't have words, no matter what the challenge is. And then thirdly, because of that, because God will equip us when we can't do it ourselves, that's how we become leaven for the world. So we should be people who are making a difference. You know, and the Archbishop has talked about that every time that he's been in a parish in our archdiocese. He talks about that from a sense of mission. And he said, real parishes are not places where you go and just get a host on Sunday. Real parishes have a sense of mission, which means they make a difference in the communities in which they live. And those are the things that he's looking at as we're looking at futuring in the church. So if places are just kind of struggling and holding on white knuckle, that's not a parish. A real parish is one that is leaven for the area in which it exists. We should be making a difference in the world is what that means. So I think that as we live, as a lot of people call us, in the breadbasket of America, we have ample examples about how God continues to sow in our lives. We're tremendously blessed. And we don't have to have it all together. We don't have to have all the gifts, all the talents, all the faith. Oh, we need that much. And when we feel like we can't do it anymore, the Spirit prays for us, and helps us through, so that we can then be a leaven and make a difference in our families, in our towns, in our churches, in the world in which we live. That's what God asks of us. We don't have to do it all. All we need to do is recognize that little mustard seed and let God do the rest.